Before the flashing lights, before sold-out arenas, MMA was an outlaw blood sport. Fights happened in secret gyms, underground warehouses, and back alleys with almost no rules. Politicians called it human cockfighting and tried to erase it from existence. Yet from the ashes of chaos, it rose to become one of the biggest sports on earth. This is the untold origin of MMA. The foundations of combat sports. For thousands of years, martial arts existed in isolation from each other. Each discipline developed its own rules, its own champions, and its own philosophies about what made the perfect fighter. But they rarely cross paths in any meaningful way. Wrestling traces back to ancient Greece, where athletes grappled for dominance in the original Olympic Games. The goal was simple: control your opponent, take them down, and establish dominance through pure technique and strength. It became the foundation of ground fighting that still exists today. Boxing formalized in the 18th century England, creating structured rules around striking with closed fists. The sport emphasized footwork, head movement, and the art of hitting without being hit. Boxers developed devastating punching power, but their hands remained their only weapons. In Thailand, Muay Thai evolved as a battlefield martial art that used 8 different striking points: fists, elbows, knees, and shins. This made it one of the most complete striking systems ever developed, with techniques designed to destroy opponents at any range. The art of 8 limbs became legendary for producing some of the most durable and dangerous strikers in combat sports history. Judo emerged in Japan, refined from older forms of Jiu-Jitsu into a system focused on throws and submissions. When the Gracie family in Brazil adapted these techniques into what became Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they created something revolutionary. A system where smaller fighters could defeat larger opponents through leverage, positioning, and technique rather than brute strength. Each of these martial arts produced incredible athletes and devastating techniques, but they existed in separate worlds with their own rules and restrictions. The central question remained unanswered. If you put a boxer against a wrestler, a judoka against a Muay Thai fighter, who would actually win in a real fight with minimal rules? Vale Tudo in Brazil, the true beginning. Long before the UFC existed, Brazil was hosting the most brutal combat matches the world had ever seen. Vale Tudo translates directly to anything goes, and that description wasn't an exaggeration. These fights had almost no restrictions on what was legal. The Gracie family began organizing these challenge matches in the 1920s with one goal: prove that their version of jiu-jitsu was superior to every other martial art. Elio Gracie, despite being physically smaller and weaker than most of his opponents, started defeating boxers, wrestlers, and capoeira fighters using submissions and superior technique. The matches were absolutely savage. Headbutts were legal, groin strikes were allowed, bare-knuckle punches to the face were standard. Fighters would continue until someone was knocked unconscious or submitted. There were no weight classes, no time limits, and almost no ways to protect yourself beyond your own skill and toughness. For decades, Vale Tudo existed in the shadows of mainstream sports. These matches happened in circuses, underground gyms, and small venues where the crowds were hungry for violence that other sports wouldn't provide. The fights were bloody, dangerous, and completely unregulated. But they proved something important. When you removed all the rules, grappling and submission skills could neutralize size, strength, and striking power. Vale Tudo planted the seeds for what would become modern MMA. It showed that real fighting wasn't about which martial art looked the best in demonstrations, but which techniques actually worked when everything was on the line. The Gracie family spent decades refining their approach through these brutal matches, building a system that would eventually shock the world. Japan's experiment, Pancrase and Shooto. While Brazil was hosting underground Vale Tudo matches, Japan was taking a different approach to mixed martial arts. Instead of complete chaos, the Japanese were experimenting with hybrid combat sports that blended different disciplines under organized rules. Shooto launched in 1985, created by Satoru Sayama, who wanted to combine wrestling, striking, and submissions into a legitimate sport. This organization was one of the first to officially call itself mixed martial arts and established rules that allowed fighters to use multiple disciplines in a structured environment. Shooto proved that you could blend martial arts without turning every match into a street brawl. Pancrase followed in 1993, founded by Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki. The promotion allowed open hand strikes to the head, full submission grappling, and had minimal restrictions compared to traditional martial arts. Fighters like Bas Rutten and Ken Shamrock made their names in Pancrase before eventually joining the UFC and bringing that hybrid fighting experience with them. Japan's approach was more refined than Brazil's Vale Tudo, leaning toward organized sport rather than pure violence. But both streams of influence were building toward the same conclusion. The future of martial arts wasn't specialization in one discipline, but mastery of multiple fighting styles. These parallel developments on opposite sides of the world were about to collide in the most significant way possible. The birth of the UFC, 1993. November 12, 1993, in Denver, Colorado, changed combat sports forever. UFC 1 wasn't just another martial arts tournament. It was designed to answer the question that had been debated for decades. Which fighting style was truly superior when everything was on the line? Art Davie, a promoter with a vision, partnered with Hoist Gracie from the legendary Brazilian family to create something unprecedented. They wanted to settle the debate once and for all by putting different martial artists against each other with almost no rules restricting the action. The lack of restrictions was shocking by today's standards. There were no weight classes, meaning a 200-pound wrestler could face a 250-pound fighter without any consideration for size disadvantage. Fighters didn't wear gloves beyond small fingerless wraps. There were no judges to score the action and no time limits to save exhausted fighters. The only way to win was knockout, submission, or your corner throwing in the towel. The only banned techniques were eye gouging and biting. What happened that night redefined martial arts completely. Hoist Gracie, weighing just 180 pounds and fighting in a traditional gi, submitted 3 different opponents in a single night. He defeated a boxer, a wrestler, and a kickboxer using Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques that most people had never seen before. While his opponents relied on striking power and athleticism, Gracie used leverage and submissions to neutralize every advantage they had. The world watched in disbelief as this relatively small fighter made larger, stronger opponents tap out repeatedly. It wasn't just a victory for Hoist Gracie. It was validation for everything the Gracie family had been teaching for decades. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a martial art that most people had never heard of, had proven its effectiveness on the biggest stage possible. The grappling-focused approach dominated striking and wrestling specialists who had no answer for the submission game. UFC 1 succeeded in answering its central question, but it also created something bigger. It proved that no single martial art held all the answers. The future belonged to fighters who could blend multiple disciplines into a complete fighting system. The controversy. Human cockfighting. The success of UFC 1 came with immediate and severe backlash. While hardcore martial arts fans were fascinated by what they'd witnessed, politicians, media outlets, and concerned citizens saw something completely different: barbaric violence masquerading as sport. Senator John McCain became the most vocal opponent of the UFC, launching a crusade to shut down the organization completely. He didn't just criticize the sport publicly, he actively worked to kill it. McCain wrote letters to all 50 state governors urging them to ban the events. He contacted television networks and pay-per-view carriers, pressuring them to stop broadcasting UFC content. He used the phrase human cockfighting repeatedly in interviews, comparing the sport to illegal animal fighting rings. The political pressure worked devastatingly well. Athletic commissions across the country refused to sanction UFC events, viewing them as too dangerous and unregulated to be considered legitimate sport. Major pay-per-view carriers dropped the organization, cutting off its primary revenue stream. Cable companies that had initially carried UFC broadcasts backed away under political and public pressure. By the mid-1990s, the situation was dire. The UFC was effectively banned in approximately 40 states. The organization had to operate in smaller venues with limited exposure, struggling to find locations that would even host their events. What had started as a revolutionary combat sports experiment was now being treated like an underground criminal enterprise. The sport that Hoist Gracie had helped legitimize at UFC 1 was now fighting for its survival. Without access to major markets, television exposure, or state athletic commission approval, the UFC was on the brink of extinction. The question wasn't whether MMA would grow into something bigger, it was whether MMA would exist at all. The transformation from chaos to sport. Survival required evolution. The UFC and other MMA organizations realized that to gain legitimacy and regulatory approval, they needed to transform from no-rules combat into a genuine, regulated sport. The changes came gradually, but each one moved MMA further from its chaotic origins. Time limits were introduced to prevent fights from going on indefinitely. Judges were added to score matches that didn't end in finishes, giving fighters multiple paths to victory beyond just knockout or submission. Weight classes were established to ensure fair matchups and prevent significant size mismatches that had been common in early events. The most significant change came in 2000, when New Jersey athletic commissioners worked with MMA stakeholders to create the unified rules of mixed martial arts. These comprehensive regulations banned the most dangerous techniques: headbutts, groin strikes, strikes to the back of the head, and small joint manipulation. They established clear rules about what fighters could and couldn't do, creating a framework that athletic commissions could regulate. Nevada quickly adopted these unified rules, and they spread across the country as other states began sanctioning MMA events. The rules didn't just make the sport safer, they made it possible for athletic commissions to treat MMA like boxing or other combat sports, with proper oversight, medical supervision, and regulatory control. The transformation went beyond just rules. Fighters themselves began changing their approach to competition. The early UFC events had proven that no single martial art was complete. Wrestlers who couldn't strike lost to strikers. Strikers who couldn't grapple lost to grapplers. The solution became obvious. Fighters needed to train in multiple disciplines. Cross-training became the standard rather than the exception. Wrestlers learned boxing and kickboxing to improve their striking. Strikers spent hours drilling takedown defense and submission escapes. BJJ specialists developed knockout power to complement their ground game. The modern, well-rounded fighter emerged from this necessity, capable of fighting effectively whether the match stayed standing or went to the ground. This evolution saved the sport. What had been denounced as human cockfighting was now recognized as a legitimate athletic competition requiring incredible skill, training, and discipline. The chaos of early MMA gave way to organized sport, and the UFC slowly regained access to major markets and television exposure. The legacy of the origins. Today, mixed martial arts is a global phenomenon. The UFC alone is worth billions of dollars. Fighters like Conor McGregor, Jon Jones, and Khabib Nurmagomedov are recognized worldwide as elite athletes. Major networks broadcast MMA events to millions of viewers. The sport that was once banned in most states now sells out arenas and generates massive pay-per-view numbers. But none of this success would exist without the brutal, controversial origins that built the foundation. Vale Tudo in Brazil proved that anything goes combat could produce legitimate martial artists, and that grappling could defeat striking when rules were removed. Those underground matches, despite their violence, showed what real fighting looked like beyond the restrictions of traditional martial arts. Shooto and Pancrase in Japan experimented with hybrid rules, demonstrating that you could blend martial arts into organized competition without pure chaos. These organizations proved that mixed martial arts could function as sport rather than just street fighting, establishing frameworks that later promotions would build upon. UFC 1 showcased Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu's dominance to a global audience, forever changing how people thought about effective martial arts. Hoist Gracie's performance that night in Denver didn't just win a tournament, it sparked a revolution in how fighters trained and competed. The political battles that nearly destroyed the sport forced MMA to evolve from lawless violence into regulated competition. Without Senator McCain's crusade and the resulting pressure, the UFC might never have adopted the unified rules and safety measures that made it acceptable to athletic commissions and mainstream audiences. The dark, chaotic roots of MMA explain why the sport is so unique today. It didn't emerge from Olympic committees or traditional sporting organizations. It had to fight its way from underground blood sport to regulated legitimacy, surviving attempts to shut it down completely. Every rule, every safety measure, every aspect of modern MMA exists because the sport evolved through conflict and controversy. Final thoughts. MMA's origin story is one of violence, controversy, and survival against impossible odds. It came from underground, no-rules fights that most people considered barbaric. It nearly collapsed under political pressure from powerful opponents who wanted it banned completely. It survived only by adapting, adding rules, and transforming itself from chaos into legitimate sport. The journey from Vale Tudo in Brazilian gyms to sold-out arenas around the world took decades and came close to failure multiple times. But the fighters, promoters, and fans who believed in mixed martial arts pushed through the darkness to create something revolutionary. If you found this deep dive into MMA's origins fascinating, smash that like button and subscribe, because Episode 2 is going to explore the price every fighter pays. The hidden costs of glory, including broken bodies, concussions, financial struggles, and family sacrifices that come with pursuing championship dreams. Drop a comment below letting me know what you found most interesting about MMA's dark history. Was it the brutality of Vale Tudo, Hoist Gracie's dominance at UFC 1, or the political battle that almost killed the sport? I'll see you in the next episode.